Bourgeoisie produces, above all, art zone. Gravediggers.
Evidence shows us that the plague was detrimental in places like Syria, which had several ports and incoming ships to spread the disease. Like, Syria at that time was known as Plague Land.
Yeah, I think for something like the bubonic plague, it's a lot more complicated than just washing your hands. With the standards of sanitation at the time, rats basically ran rampant in cities, and especially in port cities where they could basically hitch a ride on the nearest ship. So it's more about public health and sanitation and less about personal, hand washing.
The plague resurged in Europe and the Middle East in 1347. This time, it killed around 1/3 to 1/2 the people on the continent in an extremely lethal period of about 7 years. A 50% death rate sounds unfathomable to us, but remember that if you were a gay man in San Francisco at the outbreak of HIV/AIDS, it's very possible that around half of your community that you regularly associated with would become sick and die from HIV. There's no way that this is something that only happened in the Middle Ages. There were several plague pandemics during the 14th and 15th centuries, but we know that most of the major outbreak was the Black Death because people in places like London had never experienced anything like it before. They were entirely unprepared, and it was so catastrophic for them that, like those Greek and Arabic scholars of the 6th century, they genuinely thought that the world was ending. There were more smaller epidemics throughout the world, but these three have been identified as the major ones most likely to be the bubonic plague. So, what were the symptoms of the plague? What would actually happen to you if you got it? The most common form of plague results in swollen and tender lymph nodes, which are, I don't know how to describe them. They're in your neck and your armpits.
They're basically like glands that are part of the immune system. They filter your blood and basically make sure that there aren't pathogens, and are basically sites where your immune response starts if there are pathogens in your body.
So if you contracted the plague, you would get like a swollen, pussy thing about the size of a chicken egg, which was called a bubo. And if it burst, it would like leak and it had this really putrid smell. It sounds like a really, really awful thing to get. Other symptoms included vomiting, coughing blood, fevers and chills, headache, fatigue, muscle aches. But I feel like these are kind of like every disease. The unique thing about the plague was these buboes, these like pus-filled lumps.
Yeah.
The plague is much less common today, but there are cases globally every year. I think a couple years ago, there was an outbreak among prairie dogs, like in the plains of the United States. I know my cousin was supposed to go to a Fish concert, like the band Fish, and it was canceled because of the bubonic plague.
Like the band members got it?
No, the campgrounds, because you know how people that go to Fish concerts, they like go to campgrounds and they hula hoop and do that kind of stuff?
Yeah.
So the prairie dogs were like a threat.
That sounds very medieval.
I mean, at first I thought it was funny, but then I was like, no, this is really horrible.
Oh yeah, it's terrifying. I mean, the plague just sounds like a very awful disease in general.
Also, domestic animals like dogs and cats can get the plague from infected fleas, and probably during the Black Death, people's goats and donkeys and things like that would get infected, and people would unknowingly contract it because the fleas would be on their own animals and then jump to them.
Interestingly enough, firstly, one of the things the Europeans did when the plague first arrived was kill all the cats because they thought the cats were familiars for witches, and by killing all the cats, they allowed all the rats to proliferate because without their natural predators, rats had no reason to be terrified, and that just made the plague a lot worse. But also, what's interesting is that several rodent species act as reservoir hosts where they themselves are immune to the symptoms of the Yersinia pestis bacteria carried by the fleas and basically act as dormant vectors, basically like a giant tram, spreading the fleas from host to host. The rats themselves don't die from the plague, but they carry the fleas, which are infected, and the fleas then hop onto other animals and eventually people and infect them with the bacteria. The phenomena like this is actually very common with viral infections as well. For example, under the current climate with COVID-19, we can see COVID-19 is currently devastating the world, but the bats, which the virus came from, are immune to coronavirus because of their morphology. They carry these viruses, but they don't exhibit any symptoms or die as a result. They've created this sort of stasis with the virus where the situation allows the virus to proliferate in the host without killing the host, because the virus depends on the host to proliferate. This is the ideal situation for a pathogen, basically.
That's scary. I don't like this. So during the Black Death, as half of the people around them lay dying, the people started to wonder, what caused the plague. And they came up with several theories. Many of these overlap. A really big one was providence, or the wrath of God theory. So basically assuming that God, as a spiritual power, or it could also be nature generally, is punishing us for our sins. And as silly as this might sound to us, because we know that the plague was caused by bacteria, I think we pretty often hear this terrible explanation today. Like during the HIV/AIDS crisis, people were saying God cursed gay people with AIDS because homosexuality is a sin. I don't know that a lot of people were saying this, but there definitely were prominent homophobes, saying that this was divine punishment. With COVID-19, I'd say this arises more in like a present day eco-fascism. So people have been saying COVID-19 is Mother Nature's way of punishing humans for our role in climate change, and she is restoring the earth by killing people. Like we said before, the virus doesn't have a brain, it doesn't have an objective. This attitude also really ignores how it's capitalism and greed which exploits our resources. So slowing down capitalism, like during the quarantine period, will slow down, natural devastation. But it's not, I don't know how to put this into words. Why would you look at this and be like, oh yes, good, people are dying?
I mean, it goes back to these people who believe in like this Malthusian logic that, the earth is overpopulated and we must this sort of anti-anthropocentrism. And what really frustrates me about this line of thought is the people who are most affected by pandemics like COVID-19 are the people who least contribute to things like climate change. The people who contribute the most to climate change are like 40 CEOs of like the fossil fuel industries and related industries. Like you can literally put them into 3 buses. And those people have the resources, both in terms of medical resources and things like, being able to remove themselves from the cities and go to their vacation homes and quarantine in luxury and comfort because, they have a lot of money. So the idea that the earth is, retaliating is asinine because the people who are causing climate catastrophe are not the people who are most affected by the virus.
To listen to the full episode and receive more bonus content in the future, you can pledge at patreon.com/DosCriminal. Thank you for your support, and we'll be back next week with another free episode.